Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about UV unwrapping, how to prepare a model to be brought into Substance Painter, how to add simple materials to your objects in Substance Painter, and then how to bring those materials or textures back into Blender and back onto your model. This is a beginner tutorial in Substance Painter, but it's not a beginner tutorial in Blender. So if you're not sure about the navigation in Blender, I'd recommend taking a look at some tutorials along those lines. But we'll go through those kinds of things in Substance Painter, so don't worry there. Okay, so I have this motorcycle that I want to texture. Now we're not going to texture the whole thing in this video. We're just going very surface level so that you can understand the entire workflow. But in subsequent videos, we're going to go deeper and deeper. So the first question is, what is UV unwrapping and why is it important? UV unwrapping is essentially taking a 3D object and flattening it on a two-dimensional plane. The reason we want to do that is because when we flattened an object on a two-dimensional plane, we can then add two-dimensional textures onto that object, and Blender will know how to realize that texture. A good way to kind of conceptualize that is if you think of wrapping a present. The box is essentially our object or model, and then the wrapping paper is the texture. In order to wrap the paper around the box, we have to cut the paper so that it's tailored to the dimensions of the box, and then we can wrap it around the box. That's essentially what we're doing here. We're cutting the object so that we can flatten it, then we're going to put that two-dimensional image on it, and then Blender is going to reconfigure the object. And we can visualize that a little bit better if we take this seat model here, and then if we go over to the UV editor, and this is where we can visualize our UV maps or the flattened version of our model. Then if we go to edit mode by clicking tab, make sure that our faces are selected by clicking A, we see that our object is flattened out. We can see certain parts of the seat and how they're represented on this UV map. Now, if we were to add a basic texture, and I'm going to go to material preview just so we can see what's happening. So if we add a simple texture to the seat, and I'm going to add a UV checkered texture to the seat. What that basically is kind of self-explanatory. It's a checkered pattern, but it allows you to see if there are any stretch marks or how your texture is actually sitting on your model. It's a really good reference tool. So I'm going to go back to Blender, and I'm going to find my checkered pattern and just drag it in and plug it into the base color. And you can see if we go back to our UV editor, based on that flat image, that's how the texture kind of sits. And if I selected these islands, let's select this one actually, and just move it around, that texture moves position based on where this UV island is sitting in relation to that image. So again, conceptually, just think of it as you're cutting your object up so that you can add that two-dimensional image on top of it. And this is an important step if you're going to work in Substance Painter, because Substance Painter needs all objects that it's texturing to be UV unwrapped in order to texture them. Okay. So now that we know the what and the why it's important of UV unwrapping, let's kind of go through how it's done. So let's take a look at this gas tank, and let's take a look at the UV map that it has. Most objects will automatically have a UV map applied to it, but it's just usually not very clean or not as optimized as we need it to be. So we've gone to edit mode, and this is the UV map that this gas tank has automatically. And we can see it's pretty wonky. We have a lot of overlapping faces, and we can kind of add on to this visualization. So if we go to the shader editor, and then if we add this same texture to the gas tank, this is how Blender thinks it should wrap that checkered pattern around the gas tank. It's pretty messy, and we have a lot of like stretch marks around here. And so we can do a lot better, because if we give this to Substance Painter, it's going to have a hard time placing those textures on here. So let's go back to our UV editor, and I want to cut just this object up. And so since there are so many tiny models in the scene, I want to isolate this gas tank alone. A good hotkey to do that is if you select an object, click Shift H, it will hide everything except for the object that you selected. So now I just have my gas tank selected, and creating a UV map or preparing a UV map is actually pretty simple. If we go to edit mode and then we select the edges that we want to cut, again, a good hotkey for this is if you hold down Control as you click, it will find the most direct path between clicks and select those edges. And so we can just go through here and select a closed loop around our object, and we can tell Blender that we want to mark these as what are called seams, and then we'll tell Blender that we want to flatten it based on those seams. So in order to mark these edges, we just have to right click and go down to Mark Seam, and you see it highlights as red. That means that a seam's been marked. Then if we select everything again, and then select our UV map by clicking A, we can right click and unwrap. And you can see that did a ton. And so it just made it a lot easier for Blender to flatten out this image. Now, there's still more we can do in order to improve the quality of this, because you see down here, our squares are smaller than they are up here. So let's add a couple more cuts to make it easier to flatten. And the way that's easy for me to visualize this is if you've ever eaten like a tangerine and tried to peel the peel of a tangerine in one piece and then flatten it, that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to give just enough cuts so that Blender can flatten this out. So I'm gonna just cut all the way around here, vertically wise, right click, mark seam, select all of these guys, right click and unwrap. That's already looking better. I think I'm gonna add one more cut here just to kind of loosen up some of that tension. There we go. I think I like this. And so what you're looking for when you unwrap is evenly sized checkered patterns. And again, that's a reason that these checkered patterns are useful. And you want as little stretching as possible. So it looks like we have a little stretching here, but I think that's not gonna be too damaging. For the most part, I have a fairly conservative amount of cuts or seams, and most of my islands are relatively unstretched. So I'm pretty happy with this. Okay, so now you know how to unwrap an object. The next step is we're going to export this object, we're going to bring it into Substance Painter, and we're going to texture it. So in order to export this guy, we're just going to click it. We're going to go to File, Export, FBX. We're going to find where we want to place it. And something that's helpful is if you come over to the right and you see this limit to selected objects, if you click that, you can export just what you've selected in your scene. If you don't click that, it's going to export everything that's in your scene. So I'm going to make sure that's selected. Then I'm going to rename this to gas tank and export FBX. Okay, so once we have that figured out, we just need to open up Substance Painter. Let's let this load, I guess. Okay, so we have a couple splash screens. We can exit out of that guy. And once you're in your blank project file, if we come up to File, New, there are a couple of things you want to change or take a look at. So the template, I have Blender Starter Assets, which is exactly where I want to be. Sometimes when you download Substance Painter, it doesn't have this template. If that's the case, this ASM PBR Metallic Roughness is pretty similar and it should work well. So I'll stick with Blender. Under File, I'm going to find my gas tank FBX file. Open that. The document resolution refers to how big your image textures that will be exported are going to be. So I'm going to bring that up to 4K, and everything else I can keep the same. So I'm going to click OK, and your gas tank should show up in your viewport. Now, real quick, some very basic navigation tips. So if you click Alt, left click, you're going to rotate around your object. If you click Alt, middle mouse button, you're going to pan around your object. And if you click Alt, right click, you're going to zoom in and out. I believe on the Mac, instead of clicking Alt, you click Option. And to zoom, you can obviously click Alt, right click, but you can also use your scroll wheel if that's helpful. Okay, so before we actually get started texturing, we need to do something called mesh map baking. Mesh map baking, you can think of it almost as if you were to go to a tailor for a dress or a suit or something. It's Substance Painter taking this object's measurements, so when we actually add texture to it, it's much more optimized. So in order to do that, we're going to come up to Texture Set Settings and then scroll down to Mesh Maps and Bake Mesh Maps. Now we have a couple options here. The first is this Output Settings. I'm going to change that to 4K as well. That's not changing the size of our textures, but it's changing the quality of the measurements that Substance Painter is making. Over here, these are the maps that Substance Painter is going to create or measure. So it's going to take a look at the curvature, the position, the thickness of your model, and kind of compile those maps so that we can use them later. Okay, with all of that selected, I'm going to come down to Bake Selected Textures. We're going to see it working. Okay, and now if we click Return to Painting Mode, our object is now ready to texture. Okay, so like I said before, this is a very basic level, shallow tutorial about Substance Painter and kind of the Blender process so that we can get a surface level bird's eye view of the overall workflow, and so that we can go deeper and deeper with future videos. So we're going to talk about base materials and basic masks in this video. Real quick though, let's come over to the right and up to layers. A good way to think about Substance Painter is a 3D version of Photoshop. And so the layer system, a lot of the effects that are in Substance Painter are similar to the effects and kind of setup of Photoshop. And so you see under layers, we have a bunch of options to stack layers and effects on top of each other in order to get the overall effect we're looking for. But for now, like I said, we're just going to talk about base materials. So if we come over to the left-hand side and up to these folders, these kind of tabs, we have materials, which are our base materials. We have smart materials, smart masks, and all of these. Under materials, we have a lot of options that we can actually put onto our gas tank. I'm going to look up metal, and we have all of these options. Now, one thing I'd recommend is not being too convinced by the thumbnail of these materials. For instance, this metal polished, it has this kind of brass sheen to it. However, if I click and drag it onto our model, there are a lot of properties we can still change about this that will make it customizable. So if we make sure metal polish is selected, then we come down to the properties, we have a bunch of things we can change. So if we scroll down to presets, for instance, we can change this to heavily polished silver or even scratched polished aluminum. And you can see it's incredibly different than what we had with mirror brass. So I'm going to keep it on scratched aluminum. Another thing to keep in mind is you see, if we take a look at our model, you see we have this line down here, and there's a weird seam with the texture. And the reason that is that's where we added a cut in our UV mapping. And so it's showing that seam as it's applying that two-dimensional texture on top of it. That's a good reminder that as you UV unwrap, you want to add as few cuts as possible, but you also want to try and add cuts or seams in places that the camera might not see as much. So if I were to improve this UV unwrap, I might try and hide that cut, maybe along one of these contours, or maybe under the actual gas tank itself, places that the camera might not see it in general. But even if you've unwrapped it like this, there are things you can do to kind of take out those seams. One of the most powerful tools is if we stay on our metal polished and go down to properties, under projection, you see it's set to UV projection. And what that's doing is it's basically just putting that 2D image on our UV map, and it's keeping whatever seams were created in the process. If we switch that projection to triplanar, you see it basically removes those seams altogether. And the reason it's doing that is because it's projecting it from 3 different planes, and so it's hiding any seams that you might have. And so if you have an object and your UV mapping wasn't perfect, changing your projection to triplanar projection might be a useful tip to get that how you want. Okay, so we have a texture on our object, and the last thing I wanted to go over in this section of the tutorial is how to use masks. We're going to go really basic into the subject because we're going to go more in depth in the next video. But masks, just like in Photoshop, are a way to hide certain effects or reveal certain effects. And so in Photoshop, white means 100% and black means 0%, right? And so if we have this object selected and we come over to the layers panel, there's a tab just for masks. And so if we click this, and if we add a white mask, you can see nothing changes because we've added a completely white mask, which means that the entire texture is going to be revealed because white means 100%. Now if we go back and add a black mask instead, everything's gone because black means 0%. And so since we added a completely black mask, it's taking away everything. Now you can obviously edit these masks. So for instance, if we select the mask, then make sure that our brush is selected and we just paint on top of our object, we can reveal parts of our mask and reveal some of that aluminum. Okay, so I have this aluminum texture in here. Now, what if I wanted to have like this red tint, but I only wanted the red tint to be from this contour line up on my model? How would I do that? The first thing I would do is I would come up to my layers panel and add what's called a fill layer, and that's just a blanket color. And then I'd come down to my properties and change that base color to like this, whatever red color I want. Now, again, I want my red color to only be shown above this contour and up, right? And so what I could do is I could add a black mask and then just kind of paint it in. But that's going to be pretty time consuming and not very accurate. So what I might do instead is I might come over to this left-hand panel, and under polygon fill, I have a little bit more control in how I actually texture. So for instance, if I come over to my properties and make sure that UV chunk fill is selected, I can double click on these UV chunks and it will texture only those islands. And this is another example as to why it's helpful to think about how you're going to texture your object before you actually UV unwrap your object. Because if you give it a little bit more forethought, you can be strategic with how you UV unwrap it and make your entire process a little bit more straightforward and efficient. Okay, so we have our object textured, albeit simply textured, but textured nonetheless. What we're going to do now is we're going to export this texture and add it back to our object in Blender. So in order to export textures, all we have to do is we come up to File, Export Textures, and then essentially determine where we want those textures to go. One thing I'd recommend is creating a folder for any texture you export, because what Substance Painter is going to do is it's going to export several images that will be used to texture your object. And so if you have a folder to catch all of them, it will save a lot of organization mess down the road. So I've put them in a folder, select folder. If you just export, it will export all those images. And I'm just gonna make sure that they're in there. Yep, I got a bunch of images that will act as my material. So I should be able to just go back into Blender and apply these materials to my gas tank. Now, I don't want just my gas tank to be visible right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Alt-H, and that will reveal everything that's hidden. So now I can see my gas tank in context to the other objects. So now, in order to add these textures back to the gas tank, I'm going to select this object, go to my shader editor, and I'm going to delete this texture and add a new one and label it gas tank. Now, I could just select these images, drag them in, and connect them to the node that they correspond to. But that's going to be pretty time consuming, and I don't want to do it that way. So what I'm going to do instead is Blender has a built-in add-on called Node Wrangler. If you come up to Edit, Preferences, and under Add-ons, scroll down until you find Node Wrangler here. Mine's already enabled, but if it's not, make sure you click that check, and then I'll exit out. And with that enabled, if I click Principled BSDF and select and hit Control-Shift-T on my keyboard, I can then just find the textures that I need, select all of them, and click Principled Texture Setup, and it will automatically add them to my object. There you have it. Once that's added to your object and scene, you've completed the entire workflow of preparing an object for texturing in Blender, bringing it into Substance Painter, texturing it, and then exporting it out and adding it back to your Blender file. Again, this is very, very surface level, but this is very foundational and very important to understand. So I'm excited to see what you guys make, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks, guys.